Um, I don't have much scholarship on policing, so I'm going to stay away from that aspect. I have a fair amount of scholarship on guns. And the reason for that is that one of the things I did after Newtown was I started something called the Gun Report. And it was a daily compilation of gun violence that we just plucked from Google News and other news sources. And we just listed it. No editorial commentary. And among the things I learned was that there's an astounding amount of accidental shootings involving children, which are extraordinarily preventable. But the second thing that I learned was that the majority, I would say the majority, of the violence that we published every day was, as Mr. Davis said, neighbor-on-neighbor crime, mostly in minority neighborhoods. What do you do about that? Can you do anything about that in this current era that we live in, where, thanks to the Supreme Court in 2008, owning a gun is now viewed as an individual right, even in major cities where that poses all sorts of threats to the community? Well, one way to think about this is two central points I want to make. The first is Mayor Landrieu described shootings, gun violence that takes place in his city as an epidemic. And an epidemic is a really good way to think about gun violence. In fact, in the mid-90s, a scientist named Gary Slotkin came back from Africa, where he'd been spending 10 years dealing with epidemics, trying to figure out how to keep AIDS from spreading. And the violence he saw in Chicago made him think that this really replicated an epidemic. It took place in clusters. The way you could predict violence in a community was based on whether there'd been violence before. And he started a program. So how do you deal with an epidemic? You intervene. That's what you do. You intervene. That's what we did with Ebola. That's what people did with Ebola. You intervene. You isolate it. You know. And so he began a program, and I saw a replica of it in New York a couple of years ago, a program called Save Our Streets, where they have interveners, actual interveners, people who have been in prison or who have been the victims of gun violence, who understand gun violence, who would go out on the streets, meet the people who are most likely to commit gun violence, get to know them, even go to the hospital when there were sometimes when there was a gun violent incident, to try and prevent a reciprocal violent episode. It has worked remarkably well. And when you say, well, why would gang members listen to interveners? Why would this make any difference? Well, what is the gang member's biggest fear? It's being shot. People don't really want to be shot. But because they feel like there's no other choice, because they feel like this is the world in which they live, in which guns are so prevalent, this is the epidemic that we have given to ourselves. When you talk to the extremists, and I really do mean the extremists on the Second Amendment side, the gun right absolutists, there's no question that they view, there's a horrible thing to say, but they view the sort of massacres that took place at Charleston and Aurora and Newtown, and also the black-on-black violence, the neighbor-on-neighbor violence that takes place in so many of our cities. They view this as just the price you have to pay for the Second Amendment, and it's just too bad. I don't believe that's true, and I don't believe that as a country we can't do something about reducing violence in the cities and reducing the number of guns and the availability of guns, even with the 2008 Supreme Court decision. There's a gun expert named Daniel Webster who gave a TED Talk not long ago, and he basically pointed out that one of the things you could do is just make it harder for illegal guns to get to cities. So how would you do this? Well, one way you could do this is to basically regulate gun dealers better. You don't even have to regulate. Just have a transparent system where the gun dealers whose guns most often show up in a crime get posted on a website. There have been experiments along this line where it actually made a big difference until Congress changed the law, so now they can't do that anymore. But one way to, most of the guns in these communities are not legal guns. It's possible to trace them. There are technologies coming along, microstamping and so on, which would allow police, investigators, and others to trace a bullet to the gun, where that gun was sold. So you could actually trace the chain, and you could figure out who sold the gun, who gave the gun, how did the gun get to be to the person who committed the crime. These are completely dual propositions. All they require from our society is the will to do them. I will stop here. We've kind of run out of time. Thank you very much. This was an extraordinary hour and a half.